Hello everybody. The purpose of this video is to talk you through the features of Jack's language use which accurately replicate the way that 5-year-olds speak. Um, because it's one of the most striking features of Jack's language. I think it does have literary effects. And as it happens, Emma Donohue's very good at it. She does accurately portray some of the features of a 5-year-old's way of speaking. So I wanted to take you through these, and I'm partly drawing on some of the knowledge that I've got from A level English language, so it is quite handy actually for this topic. So we move into a kind of a linguistic area here. We start to use some linguistic terminology. I think in your actual coursework essay, this will be a fairly light touch. You won't need to be writing more than a paragraph on it, or you might just be bringing it into another point here or there. Um, but it definitely does give you a feature to consider, which is relevant. Um, to do it well, you'll need to find your own examples rather than just copying the examples that I've given. So to get a good answer, say C grade plus. If you're very good, you'll be able to identify some features that I'm not talking about, so some whole different sorts of topics. Um, but I've tried to pick out the ones that basically emerge in the first 3 pages, and it does give you a broadly adequate overview, I think, of what's happening. Now, if you happen to be looking at a passage where there's features which are distinctive and sort of something weird that's happening and it's not covered in this presentation, you could always bring them back to me and we could talk about them and work out what's happening. And actually, that would be really useful because that could be moving you into a very good essay rather than just a decent one. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the features. I'm going to be looking them up in the book, but I've also summarized them in my left-hand window here. So I'm going to start with the idea of grammar. Okay, I'm going to divide this into grammar and vocabulary, the two basic aspects of language. Grammar is how we organize sentences and how we combine words into sentences. There's different sentence types in linguistics: the simple, compound, complex, compound, complex. We're not going to go into all of that because handily the most important sentence type for room is sensibly named the simple sentence. And it's fairly obvious without being an expert in linguistics that Jack does not put together over complex sentences, particularly in the first part. I think John Mullen would argue that once Jack reaches outside, his sentence structure becomes more complex, and that might be something that you could look at. So if you compare side by side a before and after, that could be a feature of a very good answer. But the very first sentence of the book, three, perhaps four words. Today I've 5. To be technically precise, a simple sentence should have a single verb or verb phrase in it. They can actually be quite long, simple sentences, but because I've only got one verb, am, then that is technically speaking a simple sentence. But broadly, simple sentence says what it does what it says on the tin. It's a sentence which isn't very complicated. Jack does a lot of comma splicing, which is a feature that you've probably had me pick you up on at some point or another, which is where you put a comma in between sentences rather than a full stop. Now, this is a feature of a lot of written language actually these days, particularly informal, relaxed or friendly language. So it's starting to creep into journalism and things. But traditionally, you wouldn't get it in a novel. I think in modern novels you do. And the reason you get it is it creates a colloquial effect. So if I just type that in for a sentence spelling, so it creates a colloquial effect. A colloquial effect is where you get the effect of someone talking to you. Colloquial means like speech. And by popping in these nice casual commas, we're not using a semicolon or a colon or a which or because. It's nice and easy and nice and relaxed. People use it on social media all the time, etc., etc. So it's a chatty feature, and it's one of the things that makes us feel like Jack's just sort of chatting away to us merrily in a very natural and relaxed way. So we could just find that in the book. It's not going to take too long, which it might do, in which case we will move on. Okay, we'll move on. You've got the quote here. Okay. So the next thing that I thought caught my eye from the beginning of the book was the way that Jack struggles with questions and making questions. Normally his grammar's pretty good. He doesn't really make a lot of errors, but where he really does have a little bit of difficulty is on question formations. Now, this is accurate. Little kids do have difficulties putting sentences together, and the sentence structure of a question is one of the last things that a small child develops in their speech. It's one of the last things that falls into place. So this "how you did a picture asleep" instead of "how did you do a picture asleep" is very realistic. I think Donahue must have noticed this from her own kids, noted it down and replicated it in the book. And we can see it in the text here. "You were asleep," says Ma. "How you did a picture asleep?" "No, I was awake." So he's misunderstood the meaning, but the sentence structure is not replicating correct standard English here. You'd expect Jack's vocabulary to be limited, and it is. We get a fairly simple and restricted vocabulary. So I've got all sad here. So emotions are kind of broken down into sad and happy for Jack. He hasn't got the ability to express nuance and a precise range of different emotions. He wouldn't do, he's 5. In other places, his vocabulary is actually surprisingly advanced, but that's perhaps something we'll come to later on in our consideration. His use of onomatopoeia, I think, is very typical. So you've got it, I think it was on this page. "I wee back onto duvet and I'm snowboarding instead." Now, a slightly more standard version of this would be "I whiz back onto duvet." But either way, you've still got this use of onomatopoeic language. Now, this adds a kind of a playfulness to the language. Now, we might want to make a little note here. And it's adding playfulness and a sense of dynamism, I think. That just means it kind of adds an energy. And there's a kind of a vivacity to it. That means like a liveliness, which is absolutely typical of little kids. They love their whooshes and bangs and zooms, and Jack's full of these playful, energetic kinds of words. Now, one thing that little kids do, which is quite interesting, is if they don't know a word, they won't just go silent and give up. They'll make up their own. And Jack does do this quite a lot. So one example that you've got is "I figure out how to do off the knot." This is here in the book. "I figure out how to do off the knot." We would say, I guess, in adult language, "I figure out how to undo the knot." As it happens, Jack doesn't know the word undo. So he creates his own version of the verb, and he says "do off." Now, this is quite an intelligent thing to do, actually, for a little kid. If you haven't got a word, if you've got a gap in your vocabulary, use something similar, fill the gap. It's meaningful. Ma would understand it. We understand it. So although this is inaccurate in terms of standard English and it's not adult language, it is perfectly adequate in terms of communicating. And it's one of the things that's impressive about how all young children actually acquire language and communicate with other people. You get a similar thing with throw up and diarrhea. So he doesn't, the word sickness would be a little bit too, or vomiting would be too advanced, sophisticated for Jack, but he knows the word throw up. So he turns that verb into a noun. Okay. So you've got a verb made into a noun. And verbs themselves are actually quite significant and a hotspot, really, in terms of what makes Jack's language typical of a 5-year-old. Now, one of my favourite ones is the past tense ending, which you'll probably recognise as the ed ending. So you get this on verbs like, let's see if we can think of a regular past tense. So you might have the verb to listen. I listened. So by adding the ed ending, you get the past tense. If you add the ed to the verb watch, you get watched. So the ed moves the word into the past tense. Now, that's the regular rule for English, but not all verbs follow that rule. And the verb to cut is one of them. So I cut would be present tense, but if I want to talk about in the past, you use the same form. So I cut it would be present tense, but I cut it yesterday, there would be no ed ending. But Jack doesn't know this. So what 5-year-olds will often do is something called overextension. They will take that regular rule, and if you don't happen to know that the past tense of cut is cut, and why would you? Because that's a rare exception to the rule, you simply slam on the ed ending. So I think most people would recognize that as sounding childlike, but there are very specific linguistic descriptions that you can apply to why it's childlike. And then finally, you've just got this feature where in English, you will convert adjectives to nouns, nouns to verbs, verbs to adjectives. So we move words around through different functions, but sometimes you need to change the form of them. And 5-year-olds sometimes get that wrong, and Jack is no exception. So he uses the word to sick me, okay, instead of to make me ill. So these germs will sick me. Now what he's done there is take the adjective sick. So the sick boy, I am sick, that's an adjective, and he's turned that into a verb. Now, I would regard that as quite a creative and intelligent move. It's very typical of what 5-year-olds do. It allows him to fill a vocabulary gap. It's meaningful, but it's not adult language. It's distinctively the language of a 5-year-old. Similar example of Ma goes to thermostat to hot the air. So we've got the adjective hot. But in standard English, we need to change the form of hot to heat to turn it into a verb. Now, that some verbs you do need to do that, some you don't need to do that in English. This happens to be one you do need to change, and Jack gets that wrong, but still meaningful and successfully communicative. So overall, apart from if we just simply note down these as in a kind of a nerdy way, the grammar and vocabulary features that Jack uses, we're not really going to get any marks. We have to make that relevant. And we make that relevant by considering the significance of these features and what they add to the book as a novel. I noted down a few thoughts. For a start, as a basic point, we can say that Donahue is accurate in replicating the speech of a 5-year-old. We can relate that to context by noting that in the interview that we've heard earlier, that she noted the way that her own kids speak and tried to draw on that research in her own book. We want to dig a little bit deeper on that in terms of effect. I think it helps to make Jack seem real and believable. It adds to his authenticity as a character. And then finally, and I think this is possibly the most interesting thought that I could come up with anyway, as well as just he's a real 5-year-old, it's continually confronting us with his youngness, with the fact that he's only 5 years old. The way that he speaks is a continual reminder of that. And then all those connotations of his smallness are continually just quietly pulsing in the background of his narrative. And which of those is significant will depend on the context. So there might be a place where his innocence is the most important thing, or his naivety, or his vulnerability. And then I've used this word otherness for my final thought. Just the fact that he's not an adult, that he has a different way of thinking, a different mentality, a whole different way of seeing the world. And because his vocabulary and his grammar on their surface features are different, it keeps reminding us that his mental universe is different. His way of processing the world is different. He sees the world through different eyes. And a popular word in critical theory for that kind of difference is otherness. And I think Jack is kind of a creature of otherness compared to Mark. Especially we feel that when he gets into outside, I think, when he starts to meet all these adults, and they start to regard him as a freak, as a strange creature. But I hope I've shown you through this that a lot of that otherness is absolutely normal in terms of the way that all 5-year-olds speak and think and use language. It just happens not to be an adult way of using language. So those are my main thoughts. Hope that's some use to you, and we'll call that one a day. Thank you very much.